Hi. So quite a lot of people have asked me to do a walk around video of the lab along with some suggestions on how to set up their own lab. So, welcome to my lab. So I used to work from home, as you know. We did stuff in the kitchen, did stuff in the back room, and I used to have a shed out the back which measured 2 meters by 6 meters, which is 6 foot by 18 foot. And I quickly found that became quite cramped for me, and so I rented the lab space. But it gave me a great opportunity to start thinking about what would be necessary in a lab, what kind of things would I actually need when it came to moving into a lab. Now, surprisingly enough, the things that you need, or at least the things that I think you need, aren't actually that great. The biggest thing you need, believe it or not, is just workspace. It's cupboards and countertops to do things on. And that's what these are. Now, I built these myself, so they were actually quite cheap. I set up the whole countertop space for £500. Now, next door I've got a glass place, and I went and bought a 8mm thick toughened glass to cover the countertops, so I don't have to worry about them particularly. If I spill something, it's no great shakes, I can just clean it up. So the first thing I would think about really is what kind of counter space are you going to need, what kind of worktop space. Now obviously glass is really good for chemical work, but it's not brilliant for some of the machine work I've done. So I don't only have glass covered countertops, I also left the countertops uncovered so that machines could be put onto them or bolted onto them, so that if I want to do something a bit more mechanical when it comes to building a piece of equipment or working on something, then I can do without worrying about the glass. But if I'm doing something chemical or I want to spread things out, the glass is great to have. It's great to have for lots of reasons, because it's nice and flat. So we do a lot of work on batteries and on inks and paints and polymers and that kind of thing. And having a flat surface that you can register against means you get a nice flat finish to whatever you're doing. So if I'm doing a very thin layer, all I have to do is tape the thing to the glass and I can scrape across it and get a nice thin layer. So the glass tops are actually quite important, and some section should be glass or marble or something that you don't worry about when you're spilling chemicals. Marble not so good, because obviously the acids will react, but the glass is brilliant. Now along with that, what I've got is this thing. This is just an old sofa, because there was a furniture shop next door and they wanted 10 quid for it, and I said, hey, I'll take that, and it gives me somewhere to sit and chill and think and have a cup of coffee when I'm stuck on something. Now, along with thinking about countertops and cupboard space, what I've done is organise the cupboard slightly. So what you can see here is my chemical cupboard, and as you experiment and work on these things, you're going to acquire chemicals, and those chemicals really need to be put somewhere in one specific place. If you're going to be working around kids, so you've got kids and you're going to be at home, then really you want that to be lockable. Now I'm obviously in a building where only me and the people associated with me, and those kind of people I have insurance for, come in here. So no kids are allowed, so I don't have to worry about them drinking the acid. But if you have an area that's accessible to kids, then your chemicals cupboard really needs to be lockable. But you need a separate cupboard for your chemicals, somewhere you can put things and store things and not worry about them. There are various restrictions and legislations on the storage of chemicals, so you'll note all of these chemicals on here are non-flammable and dry. The flammable chemicals, things like the toluene, the xylene, the IPA, that sort of stuff, gets stored in a separate ventilated cupboard, so any fuming can be ventilated off. The acids get stored in another separate place, so that if I spill the acids, then there's an acid spill kit along with it as well. Now I tend to store the acids in a plastic container, and the bottom of the container is filled with a neutralizing agent, actually it's just sodium carbonate, and the spill kit is sodium carbonate and a sodium carbonate solution. So if I spill some acids, I can chuck some carbonate over it to neutralize it, get it on my hands, I can either rub on the powder or stick it in a bucket of sodium carbonate solution that's already there for me. So I keep the acids again in a separate sealed plastic container with a handy spill kit.
Now, the other thing I'm required to do, and it makes a lot of sense anyway, is safety. So all around this place are fire extinguishers. So right by the entrance door, we've got a couple of heavy-duty fire extinguishers. This one's a powder extinguisher, this one's a water spray extinguisher. I also have a foam extinguisher, which is on the other wall where I've got another water spray. So we have a fire situation here. Now, obviously these are pretty heavy-duty things because I'm in an industrial place. But you can buy these things in small, handy little sizes that you can keep around with you. So these kind of things are important to have, and you need the range of them. You can't just have a water extinguisher, because you work with things that the water is not a good idea to chuck it on. So you do need the CO2 extinguishers, the powder extinguishers and the foam extinguishers, and familiarise yourself with the use of them. So when it comes to thinking about setting up a lab, I suppose that is a kind of a theme here that you're looking at, and the theme is safety. You don't buy just the acid, you buy the acid to make sure you have the neutraliser kit. Now, a neutraliser kit sounds great, it isn't, it's very simple. It's just a bag of relatively innocuous alkali, so something like sodium carbonate or sodium bicarbonate. It's very cheap. You buy your 5 kilo bags for next to nothing. So if you buy yourself some acids, buy yourself a bit of harmless alkali in case you spill your acids. So here we are, the glass tops that was burbling on about. So when thinking about fitting out a lab, I would say the top priority was your workspace, the actual cupboards and top that you're going to be working on, because you're going to be doing all your work on those. Very often you'll be working on a project and you won't know what you need. You just have to acquire it as you go along. So as you acquire it as you go along, you'll just build up an equipment list of things that you've used before and things that you need again. And you'll just collect this stuff. But you're always going to be working on something. So having a decent space, a decent set of cupboards, a decent top to work on, actually is one of the top priorities. And it seems a weird thing to say, because who would think that that was the case? But it is, it's a top priority. So the first thing is some decent countertop space that's protected. The next thing is make sure that you know your chemicals and you've got the safety equipment relative to those chemicals. Fire extinguishers aren't expensive, but they aren't cheap either. So, and you need a range of them, remember. Incidentally, here's a whole load of CO2 extinguishers just sitting down there. So I have a whole load of these things absolutely everywhere. Now you don't see that on the videos. On the videos you see me working on something. You don't really appreciate the kind of safety gear that is behind what I'm working on, and I can't stress it enough. You can't have too much safety gear. Now along those lines, some of the first bits of equipment you ought to think about are these things, safety glasses. I have about half a dozen pair of safety glasses scattered around the place that I pick up and wear when I need them. I also have these things. These are latex gloves, and I buy them by the box load because you use them, and you use them only once, and then take them off and throw them away, because you can't work with chemicals and inadvertently scratch your nose, pick up some tea, pick up a sandwich and eat it. You can't do that because your hands will be covered on chemicals. And it won't take you long, if you do that, to suddenly realise that you're eating potassium dichromate. It doesn't taste very nice and will give you cancer. So you need an awful lot of those things. I keep about half a dozen boxes in stock all the time because I use them so often that if I run out, going out to the shop is a pain to get them. So I make sure that when I get down to about 1 or 2 boxes, I go buy a whole load more. So that is an essential piece of equipment you're going to be using all of the time and you need. The other thing I get is a supply of these things. These are thicker marigold gloves. They're heavy-duty rubber, and I use lots of those as well. For sometimes when I'm doing something that I consider a little more dangerous, then I'll use some thicker rubber gloves, or I'll wear 2 pairs. When I'm using something that's either dirty or a little innocuous, then I use one of those pairs and throw them away. Now, I'm always looking at industrial processes. I don't really want a process that I tend to do a little bit of. I tend to do an awful lot of it in one go. So I use a ton of these things. And it's laboratory glassware. They're beakers, jars, conical flasks, vacuum flasks, that kind of thing. Now, a real good place to start is with half a dozen of these. And you get them in different sizes, so you'll get them down 200, 500 and 1 litre. And those are the ones that I find most useful. The 200 do little things in, the half a litre I do, which is this size incidentally, I do more in the big old 1 litre ones if I'm doing something a bit more robust. So half a dozen of those are very, very useful. Surprisingly enough, I've found this to be a very useful piece of kit. It's a Buchner flask. It's a conical flask with a little spigot off the side. Unfortunately, these are quite expensive. That was about £40 or so just for that one, and I bought 2 of them. You buy a Buchner funnel with it, which is another £50 or so, and a vacuum pump, and then you've automatically got a great way of vacuum distilling. But it is an expensive piece of kit, but I have found that to be immensely useful. So some kind of vacuum filtration system will really help you a lot. Another immensely bit of useful equipment that I can't tell you how much time and trouble it saves, and how glad I was to actually buy this thing, and a stirrer heater. It's a combined thing that this plate will heat up and stir at the same time. And this one was £100. I bought it from China. Does a really good job actually. And having bought this and used it, I use it almost continually. Now, an awful lot of your time in chemistry is actually spent measuring things, heating things, and stirring things. So that tends to be the basic equipment that you're going to need when you get started on something. Now, weighing something and measuring something is fundamental to what you're doing. So you do need some measuring cylinders, some pipettes, that kind of thing, syringes, so you know the volumes of stuff that you're adding to things. But volume is not the only thing that's really important, it's weight. Now, I have this thing, which is an analytical balance. Now, they're quite expensive pieces of kit. That one was actually second-hand and cost over £1,000, so they're pretty expensive to get hold of. But you don't actually need that to get started, but you do need something to measure stuff out with, weigh stuff with. And I use this as a kitchen scale. It's a digital kitchen scale. It does quite a good job in terms of gram amounts, but if I want a bit more of an accurate measure of it, then there's these things available. And these are jeweler's scales. You get these for about £20 or so, and they're a tiny little scale that measure down to 1/100th of a gram with the calibration weight. And they're quite cheap and quite useful for measuring out small amounts of things, or being a bit more accurate on what you measure things with. So you can get started with those kind of things in order to weigh something, and then if you get really into it and you want to spend the money on analytical balance, by all means do. But as I said, an awful lot is then spent heating and stirring stuff, which is why the heater stirrer is so useful. But again, it can be a little difficult, and in the UK, a little expensive. They go up to about £300–400. So if you don't want to spend the money on that, there's lots of alternative heating sources. And this thing, which is a £20 hot plate, works just fine, and that was bought from a local store, and that gives you a nice way of actually heating something up with a bit of oomph. And it can be a bit difficult to control, but if you're essentially just boiling something, then that works really, really nicely. Along with heating, we have this thing, which, if you did chemistry at school, you're bound to recognise. We've got a tripod, a heat-resistant mat, a heat-spreading mat made out of metal, and a good old Bunsen burner. Now, this one works off bottled gas, so I just buy a big bottle of gas, and that can be immensely useful for heating small amounts of things. And doing experiments with, because you can hold a test tube over it, and you can put these kind of things, just small porcelain crucibles on it, to heat things up in small amounts when you want to basically see what's going on. Now, that kind of direct heating can be very useful, but so can this. And this is just a cheap microwave. It was £30, and I use that for doing an awful lot of microwave experimentation, and it's a very useful thing to have, as is this, which is a small rotisserie oven that goes up to about 230 degrees and gives me a nice heated space to bung things in. So you've got an awful lot of weighing, measuring, heating, stirring when it comes to this sort of stuff. So your basic equipment needs to include some forms of that. Now, along with all the equipment that you need, one thing that's absolutely essential is a supply of water. This might sound a little odd, but if you're working in your shed in the back garden like I used to do, then traipsing into the house with beakers full of this and that really irritated my wife. And also, travelling too far, carrying something like that, introduces a measure of risk. So what you really need is a supply of water on hand. Now, you need 2 supplies. You need just your bog standard water, that you're going to wash things with, that you don't really care if you're adding normal water, and you're going to need distilled water. Now, when I was in the shed in the back garden, I used to buy bottled distilled water as deionised water from the local auto factor. So it's easy to buy yourself a few litres of that and keep that around in the plastic bottles to use as and when you need. And I used to have a big plastic bin filled actually with rainwater that I used to use for doing all the other bits and pieces with. Now, along with your water supply, something that you need to think about, and something you need to provide yourself with, is some way of disposing of all of this stuff. Because once you've finished with things, you're going to generate waste. And you can't really just pour your acid out into the back garden and hope everything's going to be fine. And you can't really do that with an awful lot of your chemicals either. What you have to do first is neutralise them into a harmless form. And that's just really awareness of the chemicals that you're working with. So, for instance, if you are working with acids, you need to neutralise it with an alkali until it becomes a harmless salt and water, essentially, and then you can just dispose of it. Now, if you're working in very small amounts, you have to realise that an awful lot of this stuff can actually just go down the drain. Concentrated sulfuric acid, for instance, is drain cleaner. So if you're chucking away 2 or 3 millilitres of concentrated sulfuric acid, there's really no need to worry about it. If you're chucking away a lot of concentrated sulfuric acid, you need to do something about it. You can't just pour it down the drain. Now, I work on a business park. Actually, it's a park set up for this and have specialist collection for my waste. If you're working in the US, then you have specialist collection points for that kind of harmful waste. Sometimes there are special days that you can go down and get rid of that waste. Sometimes a thing is open where it has a special point to dispose of that waste. You need to double bag it, you need to take it down and tell them what's in there, but they are there to collect your waste. Now, the US has a particular legislation in that any waste arising from a household, and this is any waste whatsoever, is not actually classified as toxic waste. It's classified as dangerous or toxic waste if it arises from a business. But arising from an household, then double bagging it and taking it down to your disposal point is what you need to do. If you're in the UK and you're generating waste in that form, again you have specialist waste disposal sites at your local tip. Again, you double bag it, but there's no need to tell them what there is in there. You can just double bag it and dispose of it appropriately. And there are separate sections in the waste disposal for the kind of thing that you're disposing of. So if you don't want to neutralise your acid and you want to get rid of it, you'll find that down at the waste disposal site there is an acid collection point, an oil collection point, where you can put these things to dispose of your waste sensibly and responsibly. You're not going to be generating tons of this stuff, you're going to be generating small amounts. So in your lab, what you need to do is set aside waste disposal bins for the kind of waste that you're actually generating.
Now, obviously I do quite a lot of YouTube videos, I have quite a lot of visitors, and one thing I found really, really useful are these things, whiteboards. And I would suggest you get a whiteboard or two and put it on your wall, because it's amazing how useful it can be to scribble down an idea or two, leave it there and let it tick away in your brain. You don't even know you're thinking about it, but you'll have a look up every now and then and you'll see your idea, and your subconscious will chew it over and you'll come up with different solutions than you would otherwise have done. So some kind of whiteboard where you can do that, I would say, oddly enough, is a very useful piece of kit. So there you go, a quick tour of the lab and some suggestions about what to think about if you want to set up your own lab. Now, an awful lot of this stuff you acquire as you go along, because you don't quite know what it is that you're going to do, and so you get it when you need it, and you suddenly find yourself with a whole load of equipment. But the basic equipment that you're going to need, really, I can't stress it enough, cupboards and a decent worktop. Safety gear. Think about what you're going to be working with and get the appropriate safety equipment for it, but essential safety gear are fire extinguishers, glasses, rubber gloves, and some kind of overcoat. Because if you spill something on yourself, this will come off in seconds, and I can wash myself down, and I don't care if it dissolves in a gloopy pile of acid-stained rags. So some kind of protective clothing. So countertops, safety gear. Then think about what it is that you're doing in chemistry. And chemistry really is about weighing and measuring and heating. That's essentially it. Sometimes cooling.
So you need some way to weigh stuff out, some way to measure stuff out, something to stir everything in. So you're going to need some kind of scales. Kitchen scales will do you to begin with. A jeweler's scale is really good. Later on, an analytical balance will really help an awful lot. A range of beakers, flasks and test tubes in different sizes. You don't have to get every size, you don't have to have millions of them. Half a dozen or so in 3 main sizes, 200, 500, 1 litre will just be fine. Some vacuum equipment, so a Buckner funnel, a Buckner flask and a vacuum pump, immensely useful bit of kit. Some way of heating, so a stirrer heater, an oven, a microwave or a hot plate, they're going to be fantastic for you. So the amount of equipment that you need to get going actually is surprisingly very little indeed. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the lab tour. If you have any questions about suggestions of equipment, have I forgotten to mention anything, then please do get back to me and I'll try to help where I can. But I hope you enjoyed watching and thank you very much.